All right, so this introductory course, Introduction to Sociology, um, is just supposed to give you a sense or a feel for the types of projects and the types of research that sociology does, what we contribute to social life as a science. And so I have to talk about methods, what methods that we use as scientists. But I don't really want to get into too much depth. If you're interested in it, you would take a methodology class later on. But I do want to talk about methods enough so that you understand that we truly are an empirical science, that we have data, that we use very careful methodological research designs, and that we never speak beyond our data when we're drawing conclusions from our research. And so, to do that, I want to talk to you about how sociology methods are a tool that sociologists use to answer questions. And we develop hypotheses or interests or kind of topics of concern, and we need a tool to study them. And that therefore we're really methodical and systematic, and we're organized in how we study the social world. We do our science in such a way that people could replicate it if they wanted to, and maybe use the same method or a different method to see if they find the same things that we do. And that generally we have enough methodological tools, different data and analytic techniques, uh, that we can choose different methods based on the kind of question that we want to ask. So for myself in my own career, I have used both qualitative and quantitative methods. I've used a variety of different quantitative techniques. I've used different data sources. I've used a variety of different qualitative methods. And twice in my life, twice in my life I've been a director of research centers. So for a period of time, I was the director of the Bureau of Sociological Research in Nebraska, at the University of Nebraska in Lincoln. And then here, I was the director of the Center for Family and Demographic Research. And so I've had a lot of experience kind of with different research and methods techniques. And so the research process as a sociologist, as a scientist, is similar to any other kind of scientific enterprise. You develop your research question, you create or choose your research design, you gather your data, you analyze the data, and then you reach your conclusions and draft your report. And so the scientific method overall is you define your problem, you review the literature, what other scientists have been writing or doing research on the topic. You develop your hypothesis, for which you might use theories. Theories will give you some ideas about hypotheses about how the world works. You select your research design. So maybe you'll use a survey, or maybe you'll do observation, maybe you'll do an experiment, maybe you'll use an existing data set, and you'll analyze the data, you'll develop your conclusion, and generally, having done this process will give you ideas for further research. And so when you're thinking about it, you can think about whether you like inductive or deductive approaches. And so in a deductive approach, you would develop your hypothesis and then collect your data and then draw your conclusions. And in an inductive approach, you gather the data and you look at it and you see if it gives you patterns in it. And from that, you develop your theory. And so it's kind of being on this circle of doing the research and then getting further ideas through research. And that if you look at the data, that's the inductive side. If you develop the hypothesis, that's the deductive side. Basically, we have two kinds of major data sets. We have qualitative and quantitative. And so qualitative is when you interview people openly and you let them say things in their own words, or maybe you observe them out in the world as they engage in their activities. And so you're not using statistical methods, and it's a lot more interpretive. It's rich, it's nuanced, it's detailed. People are allowed to use their own ways of explaining things. And so, for example, I have some friends who are researchers, and they did research on college students. They studied college students in the 4 to 5 years that they were at university, and they were looking at their sexual habits, their sexuality, and sexual identity. And through doing this with qualitative methods, observing people, interviewing them openly, they found that young people were using jargon for sex that these old researchers didn't know about. And so that's how they learned about the first official term of using hookup culture, hooking up. And so qualitative can give you kind of a perspective of life through the eyes of the people who are living it. Quantitative is also really useful. It does use statistical methods. It gives you data that's easy to compare. So if I ask 100 people, how much do you agree with BGSU's smoking policy? You totally agree or totally disagree. I'd be able to calculate how many people agree and how many people disagree. It's very easy to do. It gives me percentages. And so it gives more efficient comparisons. If I interviewed those 100 people and asked them to describe their feelings about it, I'd have 100 different kinds of answers, right? But quantitative helps me to quantify people's opinions. And so there's benefits to both kinds. There's benefits and costs to both kinds. With qualitative, it tends to be more valid because you're getting the ideas, the attitudes, the beliefs, the interpretations in the own voices and words of the people you're studying. That's one good thing, it's valid, but it's not as reliable because it's harder to make comparisons, right? In quantitative, it tends to be less valid because you're asking questions of people that you think are the important questions, and you're making them give you particular answers back. And so you probably won't get the richness of what they're thinking, but what you lose in validity, you gain in reliability, that it's easier to make comparisons. And so when we do research, we kind of choose which technique, a qualitative or quantitative technique, will be best for what we're doing. But more and more, we're seeing that researchers are trying to combine both techniques. So, for example, in my own career, I've studied married couples, and I'll send them out a survey to find out, what's going on in their life. And I'll ask them a lot of closed-ended questions about, are they still married? Are they happy in their marriage? Do they have fights? But then I'll go and interview them face to face so that I can see their house and what their house is like. I can see how they're interacting with each other, and I can hear how they talk about it in their own words. And so I like to combine both qualitative and quantitative. Anyway, what happens is that we engage in data analysis. And so that's the way we collect data, we discover the patterns and uniformities in the data, we see if there's any outliers or people who kind of disagree from the average. Our analysis can be either statistical if we're using quantitative data, or we even have qualitative analysis techniques that we know how to read transcripts from interviews to look for patterns in transcript dialogue. Or we know how to have techniques for using videos to watch people's behavior, that kind of thing. And so after we're done with our data analysis, we draw our conclusions and we generalize. We say this is what we've learned about this social problem or social dynamic. But we try never to generalize beyond the data. So for example, if I were studying adolescent sexuality, again, as a topic, and I was interested in whether teenagers, as they get into their first dating relationships, do they have problems negotiating the frequency they want to have contact with each other, like through cell phones. And so if I did just a study of adolescents in Bowling Green, Ohio, I couldn't really generalize to all adolescents, right? So I might be able to say, hey, this is representative of adolescents from a largely white, primarily rural county, and so you have to be careful about what you're generalizing your findings to. The last thing I kind of want to talk to you about is what are the different kinds of tools we have, the different kinds of data sets or methods that we can use. And then I want to talk to you briefly about ethics and research. Okay, so we have a variety of different kinds of tools. We can use surveys and censuses. And so a survey is a questionnaire that has either open or closed-ended questions. So a closed-ended question would be, on a scale of 1 to 10, how happy are you? 1 is I'm not happy at all, to 10 is perfectly happy. That would be a closed-ended because I'm giving you the answers. An open-ended one would be, please tell me about your happiness. And so then people could say whatever they want. I'm not forcing them to give an answer. And so questionnaires can have both closed and open-ended questions. A census is a survey of everybody in the population, so everybody who lives in a country. And censuses usually come periodically over time, so like every 10 years. And you learn about how population characteristics on economic terms, who they're living with, that kind of thing. You can also do participant observation, so you can go and observe the social world and see people's customs and behaviors and rituals and ceremonies by participating in it and writing down what you see. You could do controlled experiments. So for example, there's a researcher called Brenda Major, and she tries to study, do women and men feel differently about their levels of entitlement? And so she does these experiments where she gives men and women stacks of cards with tons and tons of dots on them. And she says, hey, I'm going to pay you $2.50. Will you count the dots on these cards and write down the number of dots per card and stop whenever you feel like you've been paid enough? And what she finds is that women are more willing to count more cards than our men, and they count them more accurately. And so that was her experiment for showing that, hey, women feel entitled to less money than men, and so they're willing to work harder for less. So there you go. An interesting kind of experiment to kind of show that principle. You can also do content analysis. So you could look at magazines that people are leaving behind. You could analyze the content of popular songs to see what are the themes or ideas, the jargon that's used in modern songs or old songs. You can basically do content analysis of any thing that humans create to learn more about human life. You could do historical research. So, for example, there was a researcher who was interested in knowing how do parents feel about their children now as compared to the past. And so what she did is she got diaries. And so she read diaries of families from the 17th and 18th century to see how they wrote about their children. And so the hypothesis was that because children are more likely to die in the 17th century, parents didn't love them as much because they were afraid to love them, right? But she found in these diaries that parents wrote very much about loving their daughters and sons, about being concerned with their lives, about wanting them to reach adulthood, and about their grief, painful grief if they died. And so you could do historical research to kind of look at changing human relationships. Or you could even do evaluation research. So, for example, sometimes when I've been director of research centers, I've been asked to kind of evaluate programs. And so, for example, if a county is interested in offering a drug rehabilitation program, they might want to see if it works, if it will actually change behavior before they spend a lot of money on it. And so sociologists can kind of evaluate programs or evaluate policies. So the last thing I want to talk about is kind of research ethics. What you should know is that there's been moments in history where scientists have engaged in kind of inhumane behavior. So a really good example of that is Nazi Germany, right? And so you know that scientists were engaging in experiments on people who were in concentration camps, and that they were sterilizing people. They were putting them in freezing water until they were nearly dead, and then reviving them, and then putting them in freezing water again. They were exposing people to poisonous gases, mustard gas, to see how people die from mustard gas exposure. They were cutting out their eyeballs to try to insert different eyeballs. They were doing all these horrendous experiments, and they were considering themselves to still be ethical people. And so during the Nuremberg war trials, we kind of internationally got to see that. How could people who consider themselves to be good people engage in such horrendous behavior? And so after that, we really started to develop codes of conduct, ethical codes of conduct. So the American Medical Association created a code of conduct, and even the sociological world developed codes of conduct. And so what you need to know overall is that sociology is not necessarily a value-free, a neutral sort of science. Researchers make choices that will end up influencing the results. So my choice to interview a particular sample or my choice to do a qualitative as compared to quantitative will influence findings. You also would have problems if you bring your own bias to your research. So maybe my biases pick the topic I do, or maybe because of my biases I write questions in particular ways. When you look at who funds research, you often find that value-laden agencies fund research. So, for example, there's this place called the Smith-Richardson Foundation. And that's a foundation that really tries to fund particular kinds of research projects that fits their political views. And then also what you see is that universities themselves are value-laden institutions, and so are the government, right? And so the government decides what research projects they want to kind of target or fund, right? And so right now, there's a large concern with what's going on in our national arena, whether we're going to cut dollars for research, whether we're going to do less research on global climate instability, for example. And so sociology is within this really kind of controversial and politically informed culture. And so we've got to try to do the best research we can, the most ethical and value-free research we can within those constraints. And so in sociology, what we had is that we got our Code of Ethics in 1971. The American Sociological Association developed a Code of Ethics. And if you go into Google, you can find it. They've got a pamphlet that they list out our Code of Ethics. And so basically, I have a Code of Ethics for how I'm supposed to treat my employees, like my graduate research assistants, and how I'm supposed to treat my students. So for example, I'm supposed to treat my students fairly and respect my diversity of my students. I'm supposed to try to be well prepared when I teach and to be up to date with the most contemporary and most valid forms of science. I'm supposed to be prepared. I'm not supposed to ever present myself as an expert in something that I'm not an expert in. And so that's kind of how I'm supposed to be as a teacher. But I also am supposed to fulfill ethics for how I do research. And so I have to be objective and be showing integrity in research. I have to respect people's privacy and their dignity. I have to make sure that I don't harm them in my research. And that doesn't mean that they might not experience risk. So a lot of sociologists, they study things that are painful or difficult for people. Like in my department, we study people who are going through divorces, people who've survived intimate partner violence, people who've been put in jail. And so the way we look at it is that we should not cause people more harm and more pain than what they would undergo in their everyday experiences. And that if our research is going to possibly cause harm, we have to figure out how we might reduce that harm. And that might include calling the study off completely, or it might include offering counseling, or offering people the chance to just quit that particular question. But we have to be really concerned with harming. We also have to be concerned with maintaining people's confidentiality. That when I do projects, I'm supposed to make sure that I don't keep data in a way that anyone could figure out who it is that was in my study. And I have to make sure that I get informed consent. And that informed consent really requires, that people understand what the study's about, what are the benefits of being in the study, and what are some of the risks of being in it, the fact that they can quit at any time, and that they can contact me after if they're concerned, and that their participation is entirely voluntary. So informed consent is a really kind of sophisticated concept. So there's a lot more things I could talk to you about research ethics, but basically over the next 6 weeks, as I'm showing you different kind of research projects and important studies that are out there, I want you to think through, hey, what might be some of the ethical controversies that are involved in research and sociology? So that's it. I'm really looking forward to showing you qualitative and quantitative research studies, social studies about, or sociology studies about important social problems facing us. You take care.